program. And Sam will talk about accessibility and inclusion, answering the question, is the metaverse going to increase the digital divide? Now, a little bit about Sam. He is an experienced tech entrepreneur in public and private sector transformation initiatives. He has extensive expertise in digital innovation, strategy, and investments at a global scale. He's worked in user experience, software as a service, impact investment, international development, and emerging technologies. Now, I agree with Sam in his belief that it's important to be mindful of the equally important possibility of exacerbating the digital divide, given the hardware and connectivity that is required to participate viably in the metaverse. Sam, please take it away.
Thank you. And hey, thank you everyone for coming in to listen to me talk. As I imagine with the other speakers that have been here today, it's my first experience, and I'm sure for most of us, looking back on this time in a few years from now, we will just probably have a bit of a laugh as to how primitive and how crude these experiences were. Yet here we are, right? It's the beginning of something pretty exciting. So maybe if we jump straight in, so I'm just going to ask someone to flick to the next slide. Great. Hey, thank you. Well, hello. I'm beaming into this virtual space from New York. I'm from an organization called UNDP, and it is a pleasure for me to be here today with you. As was mentioned, I am in charge of a host of things at UNDP, but one of the big things that we do, and actually my colleague Guyan was just here on stage earlier as well, is that we think pretty hard about supporting governments in digital transformation. It's a bit of a catch-all word. In effect, as digital changes the reality of life for everyone on this planet, really a lot of people on this planet, how do we do that in such a way that is inclusive and supportive of people who would normally otherwise be left behind or marginalized, or people who are currently victims of kind of inequality? How do they get the benefit from all these new and emerging kind of technologies as well? So I'm excited to be able to talk a lot about that today in our work. But maybe before we get too far as well, you'll notice a couple of pictures here to the right, and hopefully everyone will notice the one on the top left. And that's probably the reality that many of us, I can't speak for everyone in this audience and everyone who's watching, but many of us are likely to be in a place where we're highly connected. We have a lot of kind of opportunities at our door. But I want to bring a couple of people into this room who aren't here. So we'll start with this kind of picture over here, I guess in your top left. This is just a picture of where Tane lives. Tane's a 14-year-old boy, lives in a pretty low-income part of New Zealand, which is actually where I'm from. And New Zealand's, of course, a very high-income country. It's advanced, but there are, of course, pockets of inequality all through New Zealand and other places that are of high income as well. And Tane has a low-end device. I say he has a mobile phone, but it doesn't really do much. Its battery never really lasts very long. And he doesn't often have enough money to actually get data. And there's no kind of reliable internet at home, so he might rely on free Wi-Fi from here and there. So kind of think about Tane as we go through this kind of conversation. The other one is also extremely atypical of the kinds of people that we are trying to support, the governments that we work with at UNDP. And this, for the purposes of, that's a fictional name, Nima, but I have met many Nimas in my kind of work at UNDP before and development in general. She lives, she's in her mid-30s, and she lives in Central Africa. Fantastic place. It's just a beautiful place, contrary to what probably a lot of us think about places like Central Africa. An amazing place, but she does not have access to a cell phone. Her husband does. Her husband's got what we might call a dumb phone, and it can call, it can text. It doesn't really do anything else beyond that, but she does not have access to the cell phone. So I really just want to start there, and I want to get you actually to do a little bit of an exercise now as well. So I want you to think a bit about someone you know or someone you might know of, right, who might be in one of these situations. Someone who's probably at the opposite end of the technology spectrum to you. The very fact that you're in here talking and listening to me talk would suggest that you live somewhere more a little bit like this than in any of these kind of situations. So rather than this talk just being really intellectual, I want you to just kind of think about that for a second. Just repeat to yourself the name of that person, or just a picture, right, of what that person's like. So we want to actually bring these people into this conversation that we're about to have. Cool. All right. So with that introduction in place, let's sort of jump into it, shall we? So if we go to the next slide, maybe. All right. So most people here would have heard of the digital divide, I would imagine. Again, I don't have people can raise their hands. We're going to try and make this. We're going to attempt to make this metaverse presentation a little interactive. You just physically lift your hands up or something. Press an emoji, so I get some kind of sense from the audience. Who knows much about the digital divide? Who would be able to have a crack at defining what that means? I'm not going to make you do it. I just want to get a sense from the audience. We've got some bubble ups and some hands ish, right? Okay, good. Well, this here, I mean, Wikipedia is of course source of all proof, as we know it. No, I'm only sort of taking a dig here, but this is how Wikipedia describes the digital divide, right? The disparities in regards to access, computing, information, resources. Now, notice it doesn't say the lack of or the supply of access. It is just the disparity in regards to these resources. So these two big numbers you'll see up there at the very top, 2.7 and 5.3. So the roughly 8 billion people that we have that share this planet, over a third of them, 2.7 billion people, have no kind of connectivity there. They're offline. I know digital divide's a lot more than just are you online or offline, but for simplicity, if we kind of look at that and just let it sink in for a second, right? So these are the NEMAs that I've just sort of talked about. That's a whole third of this room that should be full, that just isn't. 95% of those, and perhaps unsurprisingly, but still sad all the same, 95% of those are what we would call developing countries. And on top of that, a high proportion of those are women and girls. And so if you're a woman or a girl living in a rural area, that's even more likely that you'll be offline. So at that kind of top level, this is what we're talking about in terms of the divide, the inequality of people who just don't really have opportunity to access anything. I mean, throughout the course of the next few days, and even as we've had speakers talk about this before, some amazing, really exciting things happening in this kind of frontier of the internet. I mean, just yesterday, I learned a lot more about metaversities, the opportunity for people to learn so much more about, all forms of things in such an immersive environment. And personally, I'm really excited about the possibilities as well for the metaverse to support better understanding between people of such diversity across this 8 billion people, right? Or 5.3 at the moment. So theoretically, many people in that 5.3, so we'll move our discussion to this 5.3 billion number now. So these are all numbers from ITU, who we work fairly closely with in thinking about these issues of digital transformation. 5.3 billion people who theoretically have access, right? How many of those people are going to engage in the metaverse? So think about Tane. So theoretically, he is connected in New Zealand. He has a phone. How many of them will, because some of them won't want to, or perhaps don't know how to access the metaverse, or they don't physically have the ability, in the cases of some people with disabilities, to access the metaverse. So I guess because it's a fairly new area, the stats on this, I'm guessing, are a little bit questionable, but my quick kind of search suggested that there were about 430 million monthly active users that engage in some kind of platform that might be passable as the metaverse. Now, a lot of those, of course, are in things like Roblox and other kind of virtual environments. So if we kind of took that as a rough percentage, that's 7.5% of 5.3 billion. So it's a small percentage, but actually, interestingly, of course, that's growing pretty quickly. If you were to tally up a lot of those numbers around the different platforms that theoretically could onboard people onto the metaverse, that would add up to roughly about 3.5 billion. So that gap there, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to call that the metaverse divide. So this might just be a function of adoption, and we might see that gap close over time. But we will talk a little bit about the two divides, if you like. Right, one is the basic sort of: are you online? Are you not online? And then, if you are online, what are some of those kind of barriers to help you engage in the next version of the internet? Okay, cool. So maybe we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, great, thank you. Oh, we're missing some text here or something, but that's okay. Is there another slide? No, okay. All right, some stuff is missing, but that's okay. All right, I'd like to be able to just first then answer the fairly obvious question, which is, I care about it. Right? So why should we address these divides? Divides typically, of course, represent inequities. So why care? Well, in life, we generally do things because we have to, but also because we want to. And sometimes want to is a stronger pull, and other times have to is a stronger kind of motivator. But on the have to, or not to have to, but because it is the right thing to do, we want to address the divide because, as I've said, people have a right to be connected. Right? And as a global community, there are these things called the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. And under Goal 9, there is a commitment within the international community to connect people to the internet. And there have been different targets that have been set as well to make that happen. You can kind of see that here. So, of course, that's the thing that we ought to do. It is our sort of moral obligation to make this happen. And there are lots of different ways of doing this, and fantastic initiatives that are happening to make this a reality. But then there's also this idea of, well, it's the smart thing to do. So we do see some of this happening already with private sector. Then we also see this, in public initiatives. And there are lots of good research to suggest that the more people come online, the better the productivity of the nation, and the greater the sort of opportunities you can raise. So for the long-term benefit, both from a private and public perspective, this just makes a lot of sense. So this is in relation to the overall digital divide. But what about the idea of that metaverse divide, right? So over here, this sort of 7.5% gap at the moment, Tane. What's the reason for us to address that divide? So first of all, I mean, we've learned from Web 2 that when we have a certain small number of people controlling what happens in the environment, we achieve a certain kind of lock-in that's very difficult to then redress. And given that we're at that early stage of the development of the metaverse, and lots of experiments taking place, opportunities for us to define what good looks like, this is a fantastic opportunity for us to really begin to have more of these conversations to ensure that we want to bring people on into the metaverse. We don't want to see a lot of those mistakes repeated. And I think that the reason we might want to do this as well is think about the richness of having another 2.7 billion people online, or having another 3.5 billion people join us in this room. Just the diversity in thought, the diversity in conversations, and the opportunity for us to just explore so many different parts of the metaverse. In fact, the imagination, the possibilities of the metaverse are largely limited to the human creativity and imagination. How much more that could be brought into this space. if we had more people participate. So these are, I guess, the sort of obvious reasons for why we should address these divides. So maybe we can move on to the next slide, which is then to talk about, well, what are some of the reasons for us seeing these connectivity, sorry, these issues in the digital divide. I think in the introduction that was mentioned, and it's clearly the two most obvious drivers of the divide, which is, first of all, you need to have some way of being connected. Internet connectivity is growing rapidly, but it is certainly not universal. And then, of course, you need some kind of a device for which you can access it. I would also add one here, which is sometimes assumed, but never necessarily explicitly talked about, which is energy. We all happily plug our devices in to charge at night or during the day, but for a lot of people, again, go back to Nemo and that kind of picture there in the bottom left. That's not necessarily something that is guaranteed or reliable. There are a lot of these factors, of course, that form the kind of basement that creates digital divide. Then, of course, there are a whole bunch of other reasons which may be less obvious, equally important. And in some ways, it's the kind of combination and the interplay between these factors that makes it quite a challenging problem to solve. So first of all, I mean, you've all joined here because you see some kind of value and you understand, most of us begin to understand what the metaverse actually is, right? You see it as being important enough to take time out of your day to commit some of your resources to make this happen. For a lot of people, think about, again, Tane and Anima and whoever you've got in mind as well, who might be at the opposite end of the spectrum to you. Do they have any awareness that leads to a motivation to be involved and to participate? So that's one thing. A broader kind of topic is simply accessibility. I've talked already about connectivity and hardware as the baseline for accessibility, but there's the big question, of course, of affordability that's tied to both those things. The affordability to be able to either, I mean, these things are expensive, right? Even by per capita, it may not be that expensive for us, but per capita for people on lower incomes, this is phenomenally expensive. And interestingly as well, and perhaps one of the bigger barriers too, is just skills, the actual digital literacy to get involved. And most of us here, I'm going to guess, are fairly digitally savvy. Yes, the technology is new and we're still kind of fiddling with the tools to make sure it all works. But you can see, given that we struggle with some of these tools, can you imagine how much harder it would be for people who aren't used to this to be a part of this as well? There is then this broad idea of adoption, which is for me to want to continue taking part. Is this something that is safe? Is this something that I can trust? We just had a panel that talked a lot about data privacy. We talk a lot about perhaps the entities that sit behind these rules that get created. So good questions there about not just the utility of getting involved, but also the safety. And I think there was a good prompt in the last panel that talked a bit about not just safety as we're accustomed to think about it in the 2D internet, but there are so many or more of our senses that are being engaged as we participate in the metaverse that just opens up many more questions about how we think about trust and safety. And then maybe to round it all off, there's so much bias that's sort of baked into the way in which we operate at the moment. And there's a chance for us to at least call those out as we design a better metaverse, as we design a better internet. As I pointed out before, most of the people who are offline are women and children who live in rural areas. So gender plays a huge factor, race, and of course even age, right? A huge portion of people who are in the metaverse right now are young people, and certainly not perhaps young people from low-income countries, but there's a whole lot of considerations to think about there as well. And then on the flip side, a lot of older people aren't involved. And yet there is such a lot of exciting potential for this to be an equalizer. So, I mean, I've focused quite a bit on negatives, of course, but the opportunity, like we don't know what age you are in here. That's we don't know kind of what ethnicity you're from. And that's something that we can really work on and preserve while maintaining that kind of privacy and equality. And then clearly, and I'll kind of end with this for this slide, the physical aspect of it, accessibility, big part of accessibility, of course, are guidelines to support people with some kind of physical or mental disability. And the numbers are actually staggeringly high, and again, disproportionately so in the developing world. 1 in 5, up to 1 in 5 people in developing countries have some kind of a disability. I mean, if you look at it purely from a private sector perspective, that's a lot of people who represent a lot of purchasing power, right? So as we kind of move around here, that's not something that we necessarily think too much about. But again, so many interesting opportunities for sort of leveling the playing field. If you have a physical kind of impairment and you can't get to an event, suddenly there are so many other opportunities for you to participate. But yet these are some of the factors that are driving inequality today. All right, next slide, please, if you could. So talking about, of course, the problems are always the easy bit. It is quite easy to be able to complain about all the things that aren't right. Actually finding ways to move forward and working on solutions, I think, will be where the real treasure is. And let's talk about some of those possibilities. And by no means do I imagine we have any single answer, but here are some of, I think, the factors that would support a solution of some kind. So the first is, first I should mention, there are actually lots of fantastic cooperation initiatives happening globally. And I mean, I really want to applaud the XRSI for putting this on, because this is an example of bringing like minds together for digital cooperation in order for us to tackle some of these big issues. That really is the ground floor, to be able to see eye to eye and begin to have these conversations. I'll talk about this in the next slide. We'll go into some of the details of what the solutions look like soon. We are strong advocates for human rights, of course, and also in the digital space in terms of inclusion. What does that look like? How are we going to do that? And we need to just really raise the flag, first and foremost. Secondly, and my colleague Guyan also kind of touched on this a little bit before, we can go a lot further and a lot better if we share a host of common goods that could be reusable and much more cost effective, and together build this sort of public infrastructure that forms the metaverse worlds of the future. And third and foremost, I think there's just this possibility for us to reimagine how we could do things and really challenge even the way we think innovate. So let's dig into maybe each one of these one at a time. So let's go to the next slide. So here, I won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but here are just a couple of visuals to maybe highlight that first point I made, which is for us to begin tackling these challenges of the digital divide and even the metaverse divide, to get NEMA and to get Tane engaged and participating. We need ways of thinking about what that means. So here with this diagram over here, you'll see is our whole of society digital transformation framework. It's not it's not the kind of single source of truth for how to do things, but it's certainly one lens as to how we, all parts of society, I don't know who's in the room and who's watching online, but it's not just government, but of course it's going to be actors in civil society, and it's going to be participants in business and economies can come together and share a view and a vision as to what inclusion looks like, what good looks like. And a big chunk of that is, of course, going to come down to these principles over here. on the left, which are all kind of core rights, digital rights, human rights that we all have, regardless of where you're born and to what situation. You have the fundamental human rights, and this is how we see them translating into the digital realm as well. You have a right to privacy. We talked a lot about that in the last panel, and then you also have a right to free expression and access. This is what my talk is about today. You need to be connected because that gives you opportunities, and you have the right, of course, to the freedom of association. So these different sort of frameworks begin a conversation with different parts of society to help us think about interventions, programs we can design, different initiatives and partnerships we can form to address all aspects of this. And if there's something I would love to, if you take away as well, is that I think also Guy, my colleague, mentioned this at the UNDP, would invite people who have ideas to sort of partner with us, think about how we might collectively solve this problem together. And yes, it is true that we work predominantly with governments, but you also note that it is a whole of society and not necessarily just a whole of government approach that is needed to ensure inclusivity. Right, so if you maybe flick to the next slide. Okay, so digital public goods. This is whole idea here is, of course, there are collective elements that help us build a strong system that makes it easier for different actors, and in our case, mostly governments, to be able to serve the global good. So I'll give you a practical example. Sierra Leone developed a particular cash transfer module called OpenG2P, and that has been able to repurpose by the Ukraine government to be able to support, provide financial support to those in need during conflict. That is an opportunity for building on top of what already exists and also accelerating that sort of knowledge transfer. And so you imagine what this could apply to. Of course, it applies to code and in Digital Public Goods Alliance. So you see a host of different things that this applies to here, but it's also much broader than that. It's a combination of how people who've done and implemented things practically on the ground can share with others who are facing similar challenges. It's also about people who might have the finances to support a lot of this work coming together and learning from each other. So that can be equally useful for something as low a website, or it could be applied equally to, for example, smart contracts in a blockchain. So I guess that's one of the opportunities and challenges is how might we do this in the Web3 environment and in the metaverse. We want to be able to build these better solutions that can help us deploy more equitably and more cost effectively as well. I'm just conscious of time, so let's just keep rolling through and we'll see if we can save a little bit of time for questions as well. So next slide. And the last thing is really just quite interesting sort of a provocation, which is we, the 7.5%, I think we make a lot of assumptions. I certainly know that I do, right? And I'll give you an example of that. We think that we need to have a one-to-one correlation between a hardware device and our participation in the internet. That's not a reality for a lot of people who live in the emerging economies. So are we so arrogant to think that we are perhaps the only ones with the answers? And so rather than wait for people to come online, why don't we actually create opportunity and spaces for them to be a part of the answers? So rather than to assume that all the innovation is only going to come from the platforms that currently build the metaverse, why don't we just challenge ourselves to reimagine the sort of opportunities and the business models on which these digital divides can be closed. And maybe I guess one final thought here is one thing that often gets talked a bit about as an example is many countries have leapfrogged. They didn't bother building a lot of infrastructure in terms of landlines because mobile cell phone towers were now available. And so we skipped an entire kind of generation of landlines and went straight to the mobiles. So I guess the challenge for us might be right now when there are more people coming online, or those who are already connected but not part of this world that we reside in. How might we also leapfrog from the flat internet on a 2D screen to the more immersive 3D internet? How do we create an environment that supports that sort of genius that's out there? Okay, and I think the next one is just my closing slide.
Okay, great. I was just wanting to make sure that people knew how to get in contact with you. Thank you for posting
Very
that
good.
there. Yes.
So
and
yeah, let's just fire me a line. I hope if you kind of come back to the sort of person that you were thinking about, I hope you were thinking about someone, I hope you want that person to be a part of this conversation as much as you've been able to participate in this conversation today. And as we fast forward, I'm sure the richness of the metaverse is only going to grow. It's going to be a pretty exciting world, but we get to build that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. Let's give some emojis and accolades. We are going to break for lunch, everyone, for 30 minutes, and let's all come back at 13:50 p.m., 1:50 p.m. PST. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone. See you back after 30 minutes.